event. The topic for today is about the informal. I'm sorry. Can you go to the next? Yeah. Okay. The today's topic is about the informal cities. And today's speaker is Dr. Paul Jones from University of Sydney, and Dr. Sri Mariati will be the moderator for today. So before we start, I will give you a brief information about our rundown today. So we will start with the opening, and then at 4 till 5 p.m. Will be the lecture from Dr. Paul Jones, and continue with the Q&A session, and then we will have the conclusion at the end of the event. And then I will read you the rules for today's webinars. So today webinar will be conducted in webinar mode. So no visual or audio interaction between the attendee and the panelists. If you want to ask questions, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and then type your questions there. After that, please be sure that you are not asking the same questions with other participants. And if you have the same question with other participants, you can use the upvote feature by clicking the thumbs up or like button on the Q&A page. So let me introduce you to today's moderator. Okay, so I'm sorry. So today, the topic will be the informal city process of adaptations by Dr. Paul Jones, and I will introduce you to Dr. Sri Mariati as the moderator for today. She is the Dean of the School of Architecture, Planning and Policy Development, ITB, also the Associate Professor at SIPPD, ITB. She undergraduate from Urban and Regional Planning at Institute Teknologi Bandung. Also get her MIP degree from University of Stuttgart and doctoral degree from Institute Teknologi Bandung. She also member of Indonesian Association of Planners, or IAP, also member of the German Alumni Water Network. Dr. Sri Mariati has been lecturer at ITB since 1997, and her research interest is about infrastructure system with cross-cutting issues such as infrastructure in informal areas, sustainability of infrastructure, and social, economic, environmental, and physical issues in infrastructure provision. She also the initiator of this joint studio in 2015 together with Dr. Paul Jones. So Dr. Sri Mariati, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Nurul. Good evening, Paul. Good afternoon, all of the participants in this today lecture. I will moderate this this lecture, yeah, with our guest lecturer from Associate Professor Paul Jones. Before we come to the lecture, I would like to introduce Paul Jones. Paul Jones is an associate professor from the University of Sydney. He joined the program of University of Sydney in 2011. Associate Professor Paul Jones have many experience. It's since 30 years ago. Have 30 years professional experience in developing sustainable urban management, urban development, and planning solution in Australia and overseas. And Associate Professor Paul Jones also have many experience with the international agency such as UN Habitat, Asian Development Bank, USAID, and so on, yeah, UNESCO, and also Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, and so on. And he also appointed as a member of editorial board of Springer Urban Book Series early in this year. And Paul John, maybe you still remember the participant, my opening yesterday, that I introduced Associate Professor Paul John as an initiator and have a long experience, 7 years experience in managing this joint studio. Previously, the joint studio is arranged between the University of Sydney and Institute Technology Bandung, yeah, in 7 years ago. Yes. Now, Paul John, this is time for yours to give us your insight, view on this lecture. It's about the informal city and the process of adaptation in a pandemic situation. Yes, Paul. You have 1.5 hours. Can be extended. Yeah. Okay, Paul.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Bushri, for the introduction, and I'd also like to thank everyone there at ITB, my colleagues there, Bunenik and Dilik and those others for ensuring that the studio continued on this year, you know, despite the challenges that COVID has thrown at us. And it's interesting that, as Sri said, this studio has been going now for about 7 years, and I think, like the city itself, what we're seeing is, you know, various adaptations, different changes, different tweaking, and what we're seeing is transforming into a totally different learning experience for students. And I think that's a fantastic thing. I think to stick on one model can have its negative impacts, but it's great to see what's been done with Sri and Ninik and everyone else there on the team to get this global studio up. You know, to have sort of nearly 130 students and 14 universities is a great credit to the team. So I'm going to try and get my screen up and try and make sure that we don't have any technical problems. And I'm just going to just waiting for it to go on to full screen. Okay, that's great.
Yeah, here now.
Finally there now. Okay, that's great. We'll just move this bar away. And so look, I'll just go back to the beginning here. So look, I think that the subject for today is talking about, you know, the series of the Global Studio is Cities of the Global South. And I think what we thought it appropriate to have right up front at the beginning of the studio to share our thoughts, because some of those that, such as Sri and Ninik, are very much involved in this work. But I think to try and get down to the importance of adaptation and how it's actually fundamental that for students who are inquiring and interested in cities of the Global South, that really a fundamental step in that process of understanding, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, about bottom up and those sorts of different processes, that central to that is the understanding processes of adaptation and how you as students can actually go about doing that for yourselves. I just want to start off, because it's very traditional at our university that we I just acknowledge the tradition and custodianship and the law of what we call country on which the University of Sydney campuses stand. So we pay our respect to those who have cared and continue to care for country on which our Indigenous landowners live and have lived well before us. I also want to acknowledge where I am, because I'm about 6 hours from Sydney. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live here in northeast Victoria. That is the Daradara people of the Giamarthang country, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. And I think that's a very important point that I like to make at the beginning. So I thought I'd put this slide up to start off with, because I just want to spend the first, 5 or 6 slides is, given that the talk is actually, we're talking about informal city, and we're talking about process of adaptation, and adaptation is very much a key part of this process of how cities transform. But I put this slide up because this is in fact, I suppose part of the tools of how the formal city is often analysed and recorded. So what we have here, obviously, is an image of the SDG 11, and I suppose the point to be made here is that cities are managed and crafted and evolved, I suppose, through this balance of what we call sort of top-down rules, where I suppose we've got something that imposes something very strongly. And as we see here, the SDGs are in fact something in that ilk, because they're actually global. They're global policies, and they're pushed down or they're asked to move down to the lower levels, when in fact the informal city is something that a lot of us associate with what we call bottom up. So even just from a very simple perspective of thinking about the city of the formal and the informal, even though that's a very simple binary, in fact, very much what the talk about tonight is that we understand that there is the top-down ways of planning, and a lot of your students today here would have been taught about top-down planning, and this is how planning should be, and this is the rules and regulations, and you all should follow it and do it this way. But we know in reality, if we're to be honest with ourselves, that's not really how cities are made. And so tonight is really exploring a little bit more about what those things about bottom up means, and about what is this informal city that we want to discuss tonight. And I suppose it was a point that made by Alexander's work on a pattern of the cities and cities patterns, when he talked about the informal city. He talked about complexity, but he also talked about the informality, about being a reflection of underlying patterns of relationships. And I suppose for the challenge with informality is often getting to the heart of those complex relationships. What we tend to find, I think, with top-down and modern planning, and as we know when we read a lot of the early literature on informal city, is that it's all pushed to the side, it's all seen as chaos, it's seen as a mess. And when you read Alexander's work on The City is Not a Tree, I suppose what he's saying is that those simple concepts and the way you look at the city are really perhaps a shortcoming of people's inability to see and understand that, in fact, that there's really what you're seeing in these sorts of images are a lot more complex set of relationships, which for varying reasons that we tend not to have very much time or interest to explore. I think the other feature that characterises the informal city is that it's very much organic. And again, you know, you're all going to say, well, you know, what do these words mean? You know, well, what does all this jargon mean? And really, you know, that I think they're very valid points. And I suppose it's only by deconstructing informality, as we will tonight, that we get to understand a little bit more about this thing. But to me, when I think about organic, again, it's this thing about this bottom up. So it's coming from situations where you don't have this very tight top-down control, but in fact, it's very much spontaneous in form. And what we tend to find, I suppose, in dense settlements is that that these are very much human scale changes, and they're part of what we call an open system that tends to self-regulate. And I think, again, that's another important feature of the informal city, this notion of self-regulation and how that is done. Because as we know, there's some work that, you know, myself and Ninik Siliwangi did, and we examined in the case study that you're looking at here in Bandung about the sorts of rules that apply and how these rules are in fact a recognition of self-regulation. Again, self-regulation, with that is this, again, the notion of self-organize. So when this bottom up, again, some of the, you know, the key points that you need to really untangle as you go through your work and you do your case study is asked, you know, the questions, you know, what does self-regulate mean? And what does self-organize mean? You know, how do people come together and make these decisions and get these incredibly rich patterns of urbanism, which make a large contribution to the city, but as we know, in modern top-down systems, that they're generally considered to be, you know, very adverse. And while accepting some of them are slums, and perhaps some of them, you know, don't meet, you know, the basics of standards, they are a product of self-organization, and they are a product of self-regulation. And most importantly, you know, we shouldn't just focus on the physical side, but we must remember that these are, in fact, first and foremost, they're made from social, you know, relations and social interactors, which are made by people. And hence, you know, we need to show some respect to the people who craft and make these very unique urban forms and spaces. Again, I think, you know, I think that the bottom line with a lot of the informal city, perhaps what you see in the informal rather than the formal, is this thing about emergence. You know, you talk about emergent urbanism, and they are this emergent realities, that their adaptation is really part of the wider process of city transformation. And again, you know, we see it in a space-time continuum. In the case study that you're looking at, for example, in Lebak and Tamansari, you know, there's a whole range of markets there, for example. And a lot of these markets, you know, they'll start at 5 a.m. in the morning. They'll transform a space. They'll transform a number of alleyway spaces, you know, meeting points and so forth. Yet by 7:30, 8 o'clock, you wouldn't even know there was a market there. It's, you know, people moving around, doing their business, making their way to work. So again, it's important, yeah, just to understand the temporal side of things. And again, emergence. It's emergent realities, urbanism within this space time continuum. And again, you can see two different, you know, settings here. We can see one here in Lebak, this very sort of strong adaptation. And here is another one actually in Fiji, in Suva. Again, you know, squatters slowly building out over the estuaries just to the west of Suva. So again, we talk about organic. It's this, the city, informal city, it's a type of, again, random. It's this randomness. And again, as Alexander said, in the pattern of cities, it's a different kind of forces at work, and it produces a unique morphology, which some of you may have heard called fractal, or the fractal city, meaning that they're made up of these various asymmetrical, irregular, fractal small bits, which again, at first, you mightn't think that there's any pattern, that there's any relationships, but in fact, they do emerge from complex sets of relationships, hence this notion of fractal city. And again, this thing about randomness, this thing about organic, this thing about spontaneous, you know, these are the things that really are the informal city. They're not this thing, you know, that we tend to get caught up in about being illegal, being unplanned, and so forth. You know, they're important to a little degree, but really what's most important in informality and the informal setting is for students is getting to the bottom of, you know, what is the nature of this organic that you see, this randomness, this spontaneity, these different forces at work, you know, producing these unique sets of urbanism. And again, as a result of that, we tend to get this unique morphology known as the fractal city. And in fact, this image here is quite interesting. This is actually just next to your case study area. And as we'll see in a little while, this actually, all this housing here sits in a valley between the planned Dutch areas to the east and west of this. And this bridge here that you see, it's something that's only been introduced in about the last 5 or 6 years. So again, different scales, different forms, you know, modernity, different scales. Again, all add to these rich patterns of urbanism. And for us as students of city making, obviously, you know, we're all here because we enjoy and we want to understand the city, but most importantly, we want to make the city better places for everyone that lives there. So I think it's also, after going over some of those ideas and concepts, you know, the informal city has got other meanings, you know, that there's other concepts and notions. There's, I think, one that's obviously quite common. When we think of the informal city, we think about the divided city, you know, that there's obviously much inequity, with lots of people and groups not being able to access, you know, housing, services, infrastructure, and many cannot access affordable land, and hence, you know, you'll get a whole range of different groups and individuals living in the city. You get this divided city, but you also get this thing, what's called contested city. And I suppose when I think about contested city and informality, I think of a contested city as being about, you know, I look at spaces, I look at unbuilt spaces and how they get appropriated by the built spaces. And again, I look at that when in areas of informality and formal settlement, that then this happens in totally different ways that we see space is appropriated in a formal city. I mean, in the formal city, for example, if you have a big central park, you know, you might see hawkers and joggers, and you'll see joggers on certain paths, and you'll see hawkers that have had their city, you know, council, you know, accreditation and so forth, and they all must happen in this space, and over there you must happen in that space. But as we know, in the informal city, people appropriate space through totally different mechanisms. And as we'll see tonight when we talk about the case study, you know, there's a notion that we use in Bandung, which we call interface creep. We talk about this creeping out, this gradual sort of half meter or to a 1 meter or a third of a meter, these little creeping out of houses into alleyways, and just gradually over time, they appropriate space. So they contest space, they contest functions, they can contest sociality, because space obviously has various association. So contested city, I think, is very important in terms of when you think about the informal city. But I think what's also very important when I think about the informal city is how you reconcile the fact that, we have this incredible melting pot of different individuals and groups of varying ethnic, socioeconomic backgrounds, all living in the city in different places, and most importantly, in accordance with varying sets of rules, protocols, sociocultural norms, and various orders. And I think if you think of the city, not just the informal city, but the bigger city as being this sort of melting pot, then in some ways it helps you try and work your way through of trying to understand how the city works. So again, it's not just your top-down way that this is how the city works, and this is how it should be, but we need to give some credence to the fact that there's all sorts of different people, living in the city, a lot of them in very adverse conditions through no fault of their own. It's had nothing to do with them. It's just the way they've ended up. But most importantly is that we understand that they also have their own governance systems. They also have their own ways that they make rules, protocols, put them in place, and that they create their communities. And it's most important that you understand that social side first before then coming to the physical side. So, it's really interesting when you see the physical, sure, to try and understand it, but you also then need to understand that this has evolved out of some sort of sociocultural process and relationships between individuals. So I think those things are all very important for you as you go through this week and as you go through the studio. Just think about some of those different meanings about what is the informal city before you actually start to deconstruct it and you sort of pull it apart. All right. When we moving to sort of adaptation, if we look at a lot of the academic work that's been done, what we generally tend to find that there hasn't been that greater emphasis on adaptation and I suppose small scale analysis. You tend to find that generally the work that's done on informal settlements in the academic sphere is primarily, I suppose, what we'd say is larger scale or mixed scale assessments of informal settlements. And here's a couple of examples here. And there's a book here that Nenik Suhartini and myself produced in 2019 out of Nenik's PhD. And again, that study was a mixed assessment. There was looking at a number of small scale informal settlements in the city of Jayapura in Indonesia, but we also looked at larger systems about what produces informal settlements and governance systems. But that assessment, what you see here, it's fairly typical when you go to have a look at some of the literature on informal settlements. And it's only, I think, in more recent times that people have realized that you really need to get down to the nitty-gritty, unpack it, deconstruct, ask these questions at this micro scale and try and understand how they've been produced and most importantly, the implications for making better cities. And hence, as I implied in that last statement, there's really little emphasis on what we call the microscale adaptation and processes in informal settlements. And again, here, there's lots of references here. All these people make the same point, that the microscale is generally being pushed to the side. And what we often tend to see is fairly general, bigger, larger scale assessments of the city. And I suppose part of that is due to the fact that a lot of designers and planners struggle with the tools to understand informality. So in fact, what is on your left is in fact Lebak is in fact your case study. And I know, and Bushri knows, and Ninik knows, that we know that when we often start these studios, you know, there'll be looks of aghast and sort of, you know, anguish on students' faces at the beginning of the week, thinking, you know, wow, how do we try and make sense of, you know, of what's been produced? How do we make sense of the relationships and the various explanations of why, you know, little parks are here and mosques are placed here and not in others? And then, you know, what's very rewarding is generally by the end of the week, students have managed to sort of put together some sort of fairly rationale and logical way of understanding this informal settlement, and most importantly, understanding the urban form and how it works. So I think that's an important point to make, that generally larger scale assessment, and it's only in recent times, and in fact partly possibly also as a result of this studio, which has pushed the micro scale assessment, is that we've managed to sort of go down that sort of finer grain level to understand the workings of the informal city through looking at case studies. Because it's only through looking at case studies, it's only by having a look at nuanced context. And, you know, I encourage you all, even after this studio, to look at other settings. And it's only by looking at various case studies that you'll start to you'll see this repetition and patterns. And some of the, you know, tools that we'll see tonight, the typology, you know, they're essential to try and make sense of what appears to be fairly chaotic and messy, and students saying, you know, how do we make sense of, you know, what seems a physical, you know, nightmare, which is a common comment often at the beginning of this studio. And so what we find, and as you'll find in the case study, is that in informal settlements, you know, especially dense, you know, what the change that we're seeing is micro. It's small, it's human scale. It's 1 meter maximum, you know, half meter, third meter, you know, 300 mils, 400 mil. And it's often difficult to deconstruct. It is an order. And most importantly, you think of, you know, when you look at these and you wander around these places, that you're dealing with both built form and unbuilt form. And again, generally not well documented. And as we acknowledge, you know, studios, you know, it can be messy. It is messy. I think we need to acknowledge that. But it is very rich, and it's very rewarding to have the opportunity to try and understand it. And so you can see here down on the left, and we'll see a lot more of this in the corner there, that, you know, there's this space that we call the public-private interface, which we'll talk a little bit more as we go on. And it's in this sort of connective space that sort of is the glue for a lot of these kampungs, that where we tend to see lots of the change happening. I mean, it's the outer space, it's the visible space. So you tend to see a lot of this interaction between what we call, you know, the private and the public, and these, as we'll talk later on, these boundaries in which it happens, again, is fluid. And again, that's one of the you know, the takeaways from understanding bottom-up urbanism, and the fact that, you know, there are rules that, you know, just like you get taught in your formal units about, you know, city form this, and, you know, regulation here and planning principles here. What's unfortunately still not acknowledged is that the same for the informal city, you know, there are sets of rules, protocols, which students can be taught. So you'll see, you know, when we're talking about this sort of messy, we can see up the top there, we can see some of the alleyways that work their way through the kampung and join it together, link it together. And over here, this is some past student work that you can see what they've actually gone through, and they've tried to make sense of the different sorts of block patterns. And you can see things from linear to grid to cluster, and then you can see them breaking them down even further and further. And of course, some of the more interesting work has been where students have managed to look at some of these blocks over a number of years to see the change. So as a general rule, this isn't well documented. It's only in the last 3 or 4 years. And again, you know, it's been the preoccupation of studios like this one, where you get this opportunity to try and come back to making sense of this small scale, yet human scale, which is central to understanding processes of adaptation. An important concept in the informal is this notion, and we're looking at here, I suppose, housing, and so obviously the wider kampung level, is this process of assembling, and that when you see these informal settlements and the form and the structure, and you're trying to work out how they evolve and change and adapt, transform, is again, think of them as an assemblage, and that assemblage are things to do with, you know, flows. They can be economic flows, social, physical, their activities, their microscale, step-by-step adaptations, again, evolving out of this self-organization, self-regulations, and most importantly, think of them about, you know, co-evolution. You know, these things don't just evolve on their own. They're working with someone else, whether it's a group, whether it's people, or whether it's an institution or a system, or whether it's the formal system, you know, whether it's the local levels of council, or maybe, you know, to a lesser or a stronger degree. Just like you might have different signage and formal signage in some of the informal settlements. This assembly all contributes to the irregular morphology that tends to characterize these informal settlements. So in fact, this little settlement is only about a kilometre or so just to the south of your case study. But again, what it does show here is it tells you the very strong role that sort of local features play and natural topography and those sorts of constraints and opportunities play in shaping the kampung. So you can see the river on the right, but again, you can see that it also overflows, and there's another channel around there to your left. So one of the things that we're going to focus on tonight when we deconstruct sort of the processes of adaptation is that we're going to be seeing a little bit tonight about this relationship of housing to alleyways. And one of the tools that we've used to try and deconstruct and understand, and students have used, is to try and see these alleyways as resulting from changes in sort of what we call setbacks, either reduction in setbacks, and we introduce a bit of some other terminology which we'll see, and most importantly, the use of existing and new building lines, and most importantly, you know, this notion of whether building lines are legal, and then you have sort of quasi-legal plot boundaries. And what you generally find in the kampung that you're studying is that there is often a lot of confusion between the plot boundary and the actual physical boundary of the building line. And there's often a lot of confusion and ambiguity about what is which. And given there's very little enforcement, it helps very much explain how you tend to get these very much different alleyway settings. And as we'll see later, we often use the word, you know, cookie cutter, how you get this various sort of, you know, cookie-like different edges on them. And partly a lot of it is a result of mirrored different landowners and residents taking the initiative either on their own to try and modify and change the boundary, which is very fluid, which often may be the legal boundary, or perhaps it could be the physical building line, or it actually could be both. But what we generally find is that a lot of these things that are moving forward, that these changes are in fact new building lines, that they're actually gone further across their legal plot boundary and moved into these other spaces. So you're going to hear in this sharing my thoughts here, this thing about the interface. And we generally see housing adaptation, it's most visibly seen in what we call the public-private interface. So what we're talking about here is we're talking about the private being the household and the housing form, and we're talking about the public being the alleyway. It's that public, and I'll put that in inverted commas because often in these kampungs we find that the alleyway space, a lot of it is actually still in family ownership. So as much as we call it is public, it is public in the sense that it has acquired a public usage right, so it has use rights over time. But then you could also argue that it's also still private in the sense that it's under the ownership of the adjoining family directly in front of it or next to it. And so again, it gets back to making, there's nothing black and white in the informal city. It's very fluid, it's messy, but that's just part of its nature. And when you understand the adaptation, that's a domain, that's the framework that you're working in. And so this public-private interface, they're really social, cultural, and economic, spaces of adaptation. And as you can see from these slides here, they're used for sociality, so they're used for people there for chatting and talking. They're used for motorbikes, and as we'll see later, they're used for mobile carts and mini stores and all sorts of activities. So again, often use this word, they're hyperactive, they're hyper, and they can be temporal, different times of the day. They'll be more active than others. So again, you can see there's a linear space up the top. Yeah. So and again, there's not much deviation into that interface. And then you get others a little irregular, and then you get others aligned and clustered and so forth. And hence this notion of interface, this public-private interface. And then you ask the question, well, what is an interface? Is there an interface? What is there? Isn't the fact the interface the actual alleyway? I mean, if you look at all the, literature on public-private interface, it's very much done in the public domain. It talks about, the modern building. It talks about, the footpath area. It talks about the green area. It talks about the road. And they're very clearly demarked zones. But then you ask the question, what is really the interface? Where is this zone of demarcation? Well, in fact, the physical zone is absolutely minute. It's not there. In fact, you could nearly argue in one sense that the notion of public-private interface is a bit nebulous, but we still use it because clearly within this space, however you want to define it, there's lots happening. It's the stage for change, for social, cultural, and economic change. And again, it's important to understand that this adaptation. So what we're seeing here is some of the block patterns that we've been identified, but it's important again that you understand that obviously the notions of scale and the importance of how things sort of bolt up. They start from the small, so they'll start from your plots and your houses on your plot, and then they'll aggregate up to form a small block, which will be irregular, and then that block sort of bolts on to the other block. And then, you know, for varying reasons, you know, of the alleyway and the way it twists and turns, whether it follows the topography, as you can see there on the left-hand side, and I'll come back to that later. You can see there's the blue line there is a river called the Sikapundung River, and then you'll see just over a space of only about 25 to 30 meters is an alleyway space. And some of the work that we've done is to show that the interface along that alleyway, that when we put a typology to try and understand the alleyway, we find that there's different interfaces on the side which is on the river side. So if you take on the left-hand side of that alleyway, there's different interfaces to what you find on the right. And part of that is driven by the fact of that the houses can't expand there to your left across the river. So the only way that they've got to go is therefore to push further out into the alleyway. So again, important here just to understand blocks and plots. The plots make your blocks. The blocks build into sort of bigger patterns of blocks, which then make your kampong, which then make your district, and then which add into your formal city, however you want to see it in your own mind as informal. But clearly, these things can't be, most importantly, seen as black and white. And this notion of interface occurs, there's an interface at the river, again, where the edge of this kampong meets the planned city. Again, that's another interface, different scale, different physical buildings, different activities. So again, interfaces come in all sorts of definitions. So this is the case study in which you'll obviously be studying this week, and in many ways it's typical of what you see in many in Indonesian cities. And as I said, this Lebak and the kampongs adjoining it sit between what we call the planned areas to the west and east of this little small valley here. And they're important because they're very much in the city. A lot of these are actually, as we'll see, they used to be agricultural lands, and due to riots middle of last century over Islam, a lot of people then moved in to these sort of vacant rural agricultural lands then, and then slowly transformed it into what it is today. And also, as we'll see later, understanding that history is also very important to understanding the transformation and adaptation that's occurred in the past. So again, it's in northern Bandung, and as you can guess, because it's in a city, they're very much seen as ripe for redevelopment by private developers and the government. And hence a lot of these areas are very much under pressure, to fit that image of the Western city, the modern city, the global city. And so getting rid of these sort of what's seen as unsightly, again, the emphasis in a lot of the documents is on the physical, perhaps rather than, looking at the social assets and the community side. Again, it's trying to sort of, push a modern urban renewal of the city, when in fact what we do now and what you'll be doing, you're really understanding urban renewal, and you're understanding urban renewal through the processes of local adaptation, because that in fact is what is happening. Those changes that you're seeing in that interface area, that is a form of urban upgrading. It's a form of urban renewal. It's just not accepted as such. It's just not seen as such. So again, just a different view of Lebak. Again, this is looking to the south, and there you can see on your right-hand side is the Sikapundung River. And if you again, just sort of, you can't, it's not totally clear, but again, just moving across from that river, you'll see one row of housing, and then there's another alleyway there that weaves around. And as we'll see in a little while, this used to be actually a series of rice paddies. So in fact, the network of alleyways today are really actually the walls of the remaining walls of the rice paddies. So it's interesting here, you can see a couple of the mosques, which play a very important part in the cultural sort of fabric of the kampung. And again, you can see, and definitely see the interface, housing interfaces with the river there. So again, that's if you wanted to explore a different sort of interface, that's one there. But obviously the focus tonight is really on the alleyways and these connecting spaces within Lebak. It's, you can't really understand form and structure and adaptation without perhaps going back and having a look at some of the sort of early plans and visions. And what's really important here is that this Taman Sari and this Lebak area is in fact, it's, if you see right in the central spine of this map, you'll see a big green area, right sort of central and to the top there, you'll see a whole, and that was considered the green wedge of the city. And this was actually what was called the Karsten Plan, made in 1933, when the Dutch was still there. So again, you had this modernist top-down planning at that stage. And you can see again the sort of modernist sort of grid type layouts to the east and west of that central spine, which was called the Green Wedge. It was the forest of the city. It was that place for agriculture and fresh air, literally the lungs of the city. And then what we see over time is clearly a transformation in the change of use and the change in the structures and form that are in Lebak. And so again, the river there, the Sikapundung River, again is just there. You can see the river by the a lot of the tree cover, and then you can see also pretty well in front of you. You can see some of the rice paddies heading down towards the river. And in fact, the ITB would actually be up on your left. And it's important just to put some of this up again, just to help you understand this logic of change from what it was maybe in the 1920s and 30s and 40s of last century. Yeah, so you can see the river to the left, and you can see a fairly, static layout on your to the right of that, and then over change we see the unrest occurring in the late 30s and 40s. We see people moving in, we see rice paddies being filled and changed, and then that pattern continuing on to really what you've got today. So you can see this massive changes really occurred in about the last 70 years to what you currently see on your left-hand side. So this was work that we did showing it up to 2017, and it's nothing, in fact, what's happened since then is, in fact, it's most probably actually got a lot more denser than what it has. And so it's interesting to see some of the again, adaptations. You'll see there on the right-hand image, you'll see a blue line, which is actually a large irrigation channel there on your right. And then you'll see there's an overflow, and then it actually comes off to your left and it runs down to the Sikapundung River. So it's just worth pointing that up, that often major large decisions, past land use decisions, obviously have a major impact on the structure and form of today. And clearly that irrigation lines still there, houses are set back from it, but increasingly housing is building across it. It's important, again, you know, there's this concept of order, you know, the order, you know, the top-down controlled order, which we see in the formal city, and this thing about, you know, bottom-up order, which in fact, as I said, is very much about this week, is really what you're finding out what that is all about. But again, you know, think of it in terms of being, you know, self-made. It's a local, nuanced order. And most importantly, it's got its own logic, you know. We said, yeah, it's messy, and that's great. That's what it's all about. It's understanding that messiness. So in fact, it's actually in place. Despite what you read in the literature, which says it's out of place, it's actually in place. It's ordered, not disordered. And again, get back to those comments by, you know, people such as Christopher, Marshall, Salangara. So, you know, these are less obvious orders. They're messy, they're blurred, they're an eclectic mix of designs, materiality, and free-form geometry. And they just take a lot longer to understand the relationships than perhaps what you most probably find in the top-down, you know, order of the city, which generally characterizes the formal city. Yeah, so this here is actually an image of one thing that we're referring to in a couple of slides coming up is the major alleyway. The major alleyway through this kampong is actually called Gangstones Alleyway. And yes, it does have an association with that rock band called the Rolling Stones. You'll see lots of images up and down this alleyway of referring to the Rolling Stones, but it's actually called Gangstones Alley. And again, you might think, oh, you know, this is pretty erratic. This is totally, you know, a mess. But when you talk and you sit there, you meet the residents, they'll explain to you how these different, you know, additions, how these different space encroachments occur and the rationale. So again, it's organic, it's bottom up, self-organizing and self-regulating, and definitely not dysfunctional, chaotic, or is lacking in discipline. You know, there is a logic, there is an explanation to a lot of the way that these alleyways, these connecting spaces emerge. And a lot of that is really understanding the processes of adaptation that are being pushed and that are occurring on the facades of the housing. So one of the case studies that we're going to mention is Gangstones. So this is actually here shown on the left-hand side, which I've pointed out. It starts there in the south. So this is actually the main north-south pedestrian alleyway. So for those, you know, going to work in the morning, again for hawkers, they tend to work their way. They ply their trade up and down the Gangstones alleyway, and again you'll see on your left, and then the right-hand image you'll see the network of the other minor alleyways. So again, some of the hawkers, if they've got hand carts, well then obviously they can't work their way up into those other minor alleyways. But if mobile carts, they'll work their way along the Gangstones, and those that are just carrying goods and services on their back, they'll work their way up through this other network of alleyways that make up this. In fact, it's, you know, it's a regular grid. It's really an offset grid when you actually get in there, and when you actually first get lost, it's after a little while you can normally work your way up by realizing it's just a grid that's really offset. So this is really important, and we spent a lot of time trying to study what was happening and the forces that were making the changes around this Gangstones alley. And obviously, as I said, you know, there's some really rich images and really rich, urban design, urban form there to analyze. So in fact, this is actually on the top side of the kampung. This is really nearly the edge as it goes up into the main road next to ITB. So this is really the edge of the kampung, and it actually does follow a vertical cliff face here. And in fact, right in front of you is in fact behind that steel wire that you can see there is in fact that irrigation line that continues along. So and that separates the housing on the top side and the housing on the bottom side. So you see some really interesting adaptations of housing. So building onto this sort of cliff face here. And as you can imagine, initially they would have just built to the lower level, and then they've gone to a second level, a third level, a fourth level. And then as well as going vertically, then you can see a couple there that have actually come out horizontal as well. So in terms of understanding adaptation, it's incredibly rich to see the different forms of how people appropriate space. And this is interesting here. This is a really simple thing. One of the things that we often encourage students to do when to go along is to have a look at, it's just to sit in these alleyways and watch the sociality, watch the sociality that happens at different times of the day. And so what this is a great shot of is really, it's a mini store which uses its windows to display its good and to sell its good. But then when you come back at 7 and 8 o'clock at night, all those things are gone. In fact, it's actually often sometimes that they'd just be totally shut for privacy. Other times everything would be taken off the windows and it'd just be used for ventilation. So again, it's a temporal adaptation to that unique piece of space. So I think what's most important before we sort of drop down now and try and pull it apart is that, there's an incredibly strong social fabric here. It's incredibly friendly. People are friendly, even though there are lots of uni students there, students doing research. The people somehow or other never get sick of them. You get all sorts of traders, as you can see, the old timer down the bottom there with his bell. He's got his bell and he sells his ice cream, and you see all sorts of activities, as I said, social, cultural, and lots of economic, food-based activities happening within this interface, within this changing space that makes up the alleyways. And so really this research that we're going to show you some of the results of, it really unpacks these human scale elements, the units, the individual units. In fact, later on we'll use the term increments, which comprise the housing interface, and again, which they're expressed in multiple adaptation forms. And I think that's the most important thing to remember, that there's hardly anything the same. The expression, the physical expression, the use of materials and timber and the aesthetics, all very different, as you can see here. And especially that top right hand one is quite interesting, because you're getting a long linear look down the alleyway, and again you can see all different types of expression, and you get to understand how the pavement works. How does the pavement interact with a house wall? Is there street furniture? Is it fixed? Is it movable? Things about textures, materials, overhang. What's very common that you see outside of people's places is a lot of tiling, for example. So if they don't actually physically go out, say by extending their wall by ½ a metre, they might actually just claim some of this space by using tiling. So they'll just put some white tiles out. So again, it's demarcating the front of their space, which then they'll often use to sit in that space. So again, there's also this notion of space, contesting space in alleyways, and again, understanding the processes of housing expansion, adaptation, and by understanding housing expansion, adaptation, you then understand how alleyways evolve as they are. And again, sitting across the top of these alleyways are these sort of conflicting notions about what is private, what is public, what is legal, and what is illegal. And in many ways, you need to forget those, because at the end of the day, they're Western concepts. They're Western concepts, and their value in these kampongs has far less value than what we see in the formal system, and hence notions about building lines instead of plot boundaries, people claiming territory, whether it's physically or socially, those notions have a lot more relevance in these very tight spaces than they do perhaps in the formal city. And so before we just drop down, I think the best way to describe it, it is really, it's a rich, I use this theme about rich urbanism, but it's very much fine grained. It's a street-based urbanism. Things all happen around the street, and you can see all the different images there. These are all taken in Lebak, and again, there's the temporal aspects, different times of the day, outside of prayer time, things happening at prayer time, not at prayer time. But again, it's a very vibrant, very, very rich area that provides lots of insights into the real city. And I'll just finish off just before we drop down to a bit of the unpacking. Again, it's important to, we're talking about that temporal aspect, to think of these spaces and adaptation in terms of the temporal, so time and space. So again, these are early morning markets, only half a kilometre from Lebak. So again, they'll be happening from 5 o'clock to 7:30 to 8. Then after that, all this is cleared up, it's moved, and as I said, it's full of people on their way to work and moving around, and you wouldn't even know that the markets were there. So again, these are adaptation processes. They're not fixed, they're movable, they're very much temporal, related to the time of the day. Now, before we move on and actually talk about some of the process of adaptations, really fundamental, I think, to understanding what I call the physical adaptation is this framework here that I've put together for you to try and understand, because really the elements in this image here really are at the core to help you understand how these plots and the built form on these plots starts to configurate and move. And so this framework is, as I said, it's pivotal. It's really pivotal to understanding a lot of your work this week. So what you have there is trying to represent it is a couple of different sort of things happening at play. What you have obviously is a plot, and the plots there identified with the red dotted, broken lines. And so we'll assume for the moment that's all private. And what we then see, in the middle of that, we see some sort of housing of a various form. So that's the built form, that's the private. And then sitting around that, or partly around, it might only be at the front, there mightn't be anything at the side or the rear, is the unbuilt form. So again, think of, you got your plot area, you've got this unbuilt form, and you've got a combination with built form. And then what happens is this built form over time generally either moves vertically or it moves horizontally, and chances are it's a combination of both. So what we have is we have if we go back through time, we assume, and most of the photos and when we talk to people is that they are on a plot with some sort of setbacks. Things change, so the built form changes, the unbuilt form gets transgressed, gets filled in, and then we start to see the actual plot itself pushing onto either private lands in some cases, perhaps not that much, but definitely we see it going onto the public lands at the front. So we have built form, unbuilt form, all private, and then we have the unbuilt form, which is public. And of course, what's really critical here is again that you appreciate that this boundary line at the front, which also can be the building line, is movable. And so really, in many ways, that's the, when we take the contextual side out of it, when we take sort of, the specifics out of it, this is really the modular, this is the actual essential building blocks of how this processes of adaptation at this scale starts. So obviously, when you break that down, there's going to be little increments, little bits and pieces, increments which are added here and there, and they're the changes that either push out vertically or horizontal, and then eventually they'll start to transgress and push into different spaces. But it's important for you, I think, as you go through and you do some of your case studies analysis, again, to just think about it in terms of, yes, there's a built form, some private. There would have been, and maybe there still is, some unbuilt form. And then generally that's taken up as needs arise. And then where do they go? They've got nowhere left to go but towards the public space. And then we get this issue about building line and boundary line. So that is a really just a critical thing just to get a hold of, and these slides will be made available to you later, so you can, if you need to use this through the week as a tool of analysis to help you unpack some of the areas, then that's all fine. There's no problem using that. So based on that analysis and based on that framework, what we decided to do then, and then we actually with Boonini, we actually quantified a lot of these. We then, hard though it was, because the issue is, well, what is your starting point? What is your boundary? We then went through up through the Gangstones alleyway, and we basically identified the 99 properties that were there in terms of their form as it relates to the alleyway. And we use notions of things, we use definitions of things called a setback. So something where there was a bit of a private space. We then call something which was aligned, where we said that that actually came right up forward to the boundary line. We then decided to call something set forward, which is then the house actually going forward of your plot building line, which again could be your building line. So your plot boundary or your building line. And we then call that set forward. And then we also introduced another one, which we called set above. So in other words, that sort of, you mightn't have filled out, you mightn't have done your set forward, but you've actually gone up and you've gone outwards, if that makes sense. So you mightn't have gone out necessarily at street level. Sometimes you've got a set forward. Maybe what you've got is just a set above and not a set forward. And so look, that again, this process of physical adaptation, so this typology there, again, that's the sort of basic, they're the basic sort of steps that we see in terms of how housing sort of adapts and moves into these alleyways and shapes these alleyways. And of course, they don't just exist on their own, they exist in multiple combinations, all sorts of combinations. You know, you can have a half a setback or a third of a setback. You can have a bit of a line. You might even have a bit of set forward. You can have all these varying combinations and configurations, and hence you get, you know, different spatial patterns, and obviously at the plot level you get some physical expression. So again, here's a tool for you to help you deconstruct some of this, you know, some of the adaptation that's actually occurring by trying to see if you can put this change in this housing frontages of facades into some sort of kind of basic typology as we've done here. And here is the same sort of, you know, just shown in a different form. So set back, align, and set forward. So they're the main ones. And obviously what we did as part of the analysis, we use things, obviously distance. So distance and proximity really are the key variables here. This is what we've used to identify these different concepts. And then later we actually then also looked at this interface in terms of number of windows and doors and fence heights and so forth, whether they're permeable and not permeable, can you see through and can't see through, visibility, those sorts of things. So again, still the notion of the interface, but then moving further from just the physical. And so this is, if we put that another way, if we look from a top-down plan view, then this is the sort of physical and spatial patterns and arrangements that we see of these different typologies, these typologies of adaptation, which then produce this irregular morphology. So, you know, what we see through the middle there, the dark is actually the alleyway. And then what we've tried to do is to show you, again, at a plan view, the different combinations of these typologies. So the setback, the aligned setback, aligned set forward, and sort of what is sort of some bit of a messy little private public interface where they've either put some sort of outside table or they've put some tiles. So again, trying to introduce another sort of type of space and delineation. But this is the sort of physical and spatial patterns that using this typology, this then helps you start to explain this sort of trend. But again, the issue with this is the starting point. You know, which boundary line did you use? And so what we tended to do would be to get on the corner of each block and try and find the original house. And in most blocks, there was an original house still with a setback, still with a half wall, concrete wall, still with a bit of space in between. And then often around that, you would find then everything else has come forward and filled in. But in most plots, you'd find the original, and then that was your starting point then to try and identify all these other different configurations. And that was one of the difficult parts. And in fact, it's most probably one of the hardest constraints of this study. But again, I suppose what it's showing you is it's part and parcel of this morphology. And it's most probably part and parcel of the reason that people don't study it, because it is difficult. It's messy. It's not straightforward. You know, it's not straightforward, and hence it hasn't perhaps been studied in depth as it should be. So this really here is what we looked at then was actually, so then was to do the numerical, and just again went through block by block, added them up, and then we looked at the arrangement. So again, you can see setback, there's still 37% have got some setback. We've seen there's a quarter of all the housing is aligned, so they've actually come up to the plot boundary or building line. 8% set forward. Again, a mixture of setback and align, about 23%. So again, they're in the process of coming forward, and then aligned and set forward, so 5%, and then some setback, aligned and set forward. So again, you can see the three main ones are setback, aligned, set forward happening, but again, in this process of transition over time. They're in this setback aligned with the setback. So this is actually looking at gangstones. And what's interesting, as I said to you before, is the difference on the eastern side of the alleyway versus the western side. So on the eastern side, there was 52 plots and 46 on the western side. And what you tend to find is that on the river side of the alleyway, so on the left-hand side of the alleyway as you go north, it has the greatest number of primary forms, meaning that it's got the greatest number of, so blue is the river side of the alleyway, and as you expect, it's got the greatest setbacks. It's got the greatest align. Oh, sorry, it's the red. Sorry, this is the left-hand side. It's got this number of setbacks. This is light, but most importantly, it's got the greatest number of set forwards. And the explanation for that, as the residents tell you, is that we can't go any further out the back because we can't extend over the river. The only way to come is to come the other way into the alleyway. So it's actually, there's houses. So there is an explanation. There is a rule. There is a protocol to the reason why set forwards are more prominent on one side than the other. And this here is really, again, just some of the more details if you wanted to get into it. So again, housing setbacks on the river to the other, 31 compared to 33. So more set forwards on the riverside as the houses cannot go horizontally. They only go upwards, or again, set forward into the alleyways. And again, you can see there's different combinations and so forth, and some are relatively even. But this is the interesting one here, that the different, the more set forwards can be explained by the fact they're constrained on one side, so therefore they have no option but then to encroach and adapt more adaptations onto the alleyway on the eastern side of the alleyway. And so again, just coming back to that point that we didn't pick up, and so you could actually then go down to another level, would be then to study what we call these unfixed temporal activities. So they're very innovative in their adaptation of built form, but again, they're temporary, come at a certain time of the day. Same with these sorts of things, these urban greenery and so forth. Some are permanent, some are actually, the residents put them up in the morning, move them, turn them around and put them on the inside within their house at night for security reasons. And so, as I said, if you take the interface further, so if you don't just look at it in terms of its physical sort of shape and its form, and those things about setback and align and so forth, what we also then was also measured out things about materiality, gaze. What was a half fence? What was a full fence? What sort of material was it? Was it porous? Could you see through? Could you not see through? And again, blank walls, where blank walls were and so forth. So again, these provide you with a method and tools to try and understand the interface and the interface adaptations. Some people would have a half fence, which would be a fully concrete masonry, and then above it they would still have the grate, but then at a certain time of the day they'd actually lift up and put a cover over it. So again, all sorts of adaptations, and we try to get those into some of these this numerical analysis that we did. Now, I think this is really important, is again, the point to make, and to make why, trying to work in this space is difficult. And that is because adaptation occurs via this fluid plot boundary, that plot boundary or line, and changes the way the alleyway functions and its form over time. So I think, you know, this is really important. So on the left-hand side here, you can see the sort of alleyway, perhaps in terms of its width. So again, we're just trying to give you the sort of graphic of plan view of how this has changed over time. So this on the left would have been the original form, a little bit of irregular back in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and then you have this ongoing transformation caused by all these individual adaptations. And I think that's the important thing to remember here, that you know, these blocks are only, you know, 5 to 7 and 8 meters wide, these individual lots, if that. And what you're looking at is you're looking at the sum of those. So you're looking at the sum of those frontages causing these unique alleyway forms. You know, they're not all just built to the building line with a straight front row. Everyone is different. And so it's the sum of those small parts and the sum of those relationships that made those adaptations that then gives you then the physical and spatial patterns that you see in the interface, and which define the interface, define the alleyway, and define the housing frontage. And again, this is a good shot here of how space is contested with different, you know, different forms and different functions. I think, you know, it's a really good shot. In fact, down there further on the left-hand side, you can see I just passed the motorbike, or maybe the portable little store there. You'll see an open area, and that little garden is the original house, and we use that there as the line on that side then to work out all the different changes that occurred. But this is it's an interesting image because it tells you all sorts of, you know, interesting things, from, you know, the different sorts of fencing, the different sorts of functions, and also things about services and so forth that are in the pavement at the street level.
Paul, very sorry, Paul. It's 5 minutes more to finish the presentation.
Fantastic. We'll be there in 4 minutes and 59. Okay, so the bottom line is that then these processes give you this cookie cutter. So we call this cookie cutter, and hence this is again the plan view of what we're seeing. And so this, by looking at the adaptation processes using that topology, you can then understand what's happening at the front, and you can also then understand the individual alleyway. Then what's important is that these adaptation processes lead to these different building lines either aligning and exceeding the front boundary. And so most important thing for you to take out is that these changes set precedents for residents to follow, and they become the accepted levels of the new transgression. So I think that's important for you to take out. That there's this notion that we will, I think it's here in a minute or so, we call interface creep. And you can see on the right-hand side, the wider, and then slowly coming in. So they creep, they creep. And it's because the changes are so small, you tend often perhaps not to notice it as much. As we just go to finish off, it's important now that we turn to this thing about increment types, that you can then break down this adaptation into these physical increment types. So again, we'll make this available to you. So different things that are done. So you can add a floor, you can put external access stairs, for example. You can amalgamate a plot, make it bigger. You can attach some services. You can retain open space. You can add veranda. You can do mobile elements. And again, you can set forward and all those different processes. So these are what we call the increments. These are the increments of change. These are the actual little modular bits and pieces that make these adaptation processes work and happen. And they help explain the emergence of this urbanism. And it's important here, just before we finish off, that these alleyways just don't keep going in and going in. They will, to a certain point, stop. And so this here you can see is actual lines that have been painted by both the local little RW leaders and residents, here indicating that these white lines are in fact, you know, we don't want you to push further into this alleyway, because this is the major alleyway. And if you go into that, if you go less than 2 meters, which is enough for pretty well 2 motorbikes when they're stationary or one moving to pass, then its functionality decreases. And so clearly the local government and the residents are saying, please remember that, sure, it's hyper, it's changing, but we don't want you to go any lower than this. So we can see on the left is an outer edge alleyway, which performs a lot bigger functions. People ride their motorbikes and so forth. And likewise here, you're getting into gangstones on your right. And again, they're making the same point, that we don't want functionality to disappear completely. So we're just getting to finishing off. And so again, when we look at this process of housing adaptation, this micro scale, just think of one way to think about it is this notion of this thing, what we call interface creep, and we've documented it in our papers of going forwards and upwards, and there's various combinations. And it's, again, it's this minute, minuscule micro scale changes. So we're just going towards the end. And I thought we'd just sort of finish off with some of these that, you know, this bottom up, this micro adaptation, you know, they're central to the self-organized city. And one of the tools of adaptation is obviously negotiation. And that image on the right is a classic, on the left, sorry, is a classic example how two landowners on either side of the alleyway have obviously compromised, and they've negotiated. You can see what's happened as the buildings have gone up, that the green one has gone over and pushed into his balcony, and possibly the balcony on the left wasn't there at that time. But then what you see where the second story is on your left, that owner has then decided that he'll then go back over and claim some space that possibly is in the other person's place. So that's a great example. And again, from talking to residents, they'll tell you that this negotiation and sort of compromise is a key part of the adaptation process. And you can't get a better image which actually shows you that negotiation there. So just finishing off, these are some of the last points I want to make. Is I think as you go through the week and in your studio groups, that it's essential to understand the micro scale and adaptation processes. If you really want to understand what I call the real city and this sort of co-production of spaces. A fantastic tool, which I think hopefully we've shown here, is using typology analysis, especially in diverse, high density, complex settings, where initially it's very hard to make sense of things. It's a great tool to understand the increments of change, things of doors, stairs, and patterns, the forms and spatial. And just remember that some of these spaces are incredibly hyperactive and they're adaptable to change, but with limits. And understanding the bottom-up rules and protocols, you know, which are at play, you know, that they're part and parcel of the informal cities. But again, they're what I would call some of the ignorant, you know, people, which I would call, you know, they call them chaos and mess, and they're definitely far from it. And so the questions I think for you to ask as you go through and do some of your work is that, you know, ask what micro scale changes have occurred due to COVID. You know, what can you see in some of these alleyways, and what are the modifications and adaptations in the public-private interface? And you'll see in a lot of these alleyways that there has been changes, there has been small changes, there has been different things inserted into the alleyways, and people have changed perhaps the way they open doors and the way they interface with some of these things for COVID. So I think that's really, really important for you to think about these spaces. I think about them just in terms of adaptation process, and also what's important is COVID. And so I think just to finish off, that the material for this presentation is based on these two papers, and maybe Nenik can make them available. One is that done by Nenik and myself, and again that's on about order and rules. So again, that's looking at built form and trying to understand the different rules that will apply. And then there's another one which is just out end of last year in the International Journal of Housing. And that's it. Have I made the 5 minutes, Shri?
Yes, Paul. Yes,
Okay.
this is very interesting presentation. Thank you, Paul. But we have certain time, yeah, to finish this.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So we have 6 questions. Maybe I will also summarize, yeah, the question from the participant. The first question is from Erwin Nugraha. How are you, Erwin? He has 2 questions. The first question is, do you find that something happened in Lebak Siliwangi is specific things that different from other country or from other global south? And then the second question, you use the notion of organic, yeah, and messy, yeah. Do you think that this notion may depoliticize residents in informal settlements from their unjust and equal condition from assessing housing market?
Okay, right. Okay, I'll just get you to help me as we go through in case I can't remember. But on the first one, I think the first one is asking, is what you see in Lebak unique in Lebak, or do we see that elsewhere? And I think the answer to that is that each of these contexts is unique, but from what I see, and in the length of my time involved in this, is that the patterns you see and the processes, the processes of adaptation and how they change over time, I don't think there's too much difference there in terms of these processes. The fact, the way they assemble. So the basic processes, I don't think there's any difference. What is obviously different is you're going to get different results because each area is contextually different. You know, it might be something that's strongly aligned to Islam, or it has perhaps, you know, some modern planning areas and informal areas. Each area will give you a different result. But I think that your tools of analysis, using typology, the different things about interface, those sorts of things, I think you find same. What you're going to get, just like we talked about those, you know, the fact that being more set forwards on one side than another. Obviously, if you look at a different area, then you're going to get a different result. You might even have a river. But again, I think that the processes, the way you can look at them, I think some of the tools here are a good starting point. So I think the second question is about using language. You know, it's a good question actually about the language of informal urbanism, and by using such terms such as messy and chaotic, do you actually perhaps put it into the political realm? And I suppose that, look, the answer to that is yes, but then you could also argue that the chances are is that it's already in the political realm, and it's possibly not because of, you know, terms used by academics such as Messi and so forth. It's the fact that, you know, as we see, and definitely we see in Bandung's case, is that again, it's associated more with a top-down version of what the city should be and what the city is, and there is a vision about what the city should be, and that there's a, you know, the governments will have a city, and Bandung has, you know, done some fantastic modernization and whatever, but they also, you know, they want these areas cleaned up and certain things fixed up. So I would say that the political side is most probably already there, and in fact, it's more associated with the fact of, you know, wanting to clean up the image and make it a sort of modern global city, more than to do with, you know, the fact that there's actually something messy. Sure, they'll be concerned with the visual, what they see visually, and less with perhaps the fact that there's actually real people in there. and that they've actually got together and created these spaces through certain processes, which perhaps doesn't get, again, which should get the political recognition, but perhaps doesn't. I hope that helps answer that one. That's a good question.
Yes, Paul, we come to the second question from Heriani from the Ministry of Public Works and Housing. It's she asked about the notion of informal city and slum. So how we differentiate these things, because sometimes if we look at the definition, informal city sometimes related to the cultural process. Yeah? And maybe it cannot be categorized as a slum because this is the cultural process. So how we differentiate between informal and slum? Yes, maybe informal and illegal, maybe something like that.
Yeah, no, that's
it's informal. It's different or it's the same?
No. Look, I think they're definitely different. I think the first thing to say is that we shouldn't, even though at the end of the day it's the city. I mean, that's the most important thing. It's the city, and sure, the fact that we sort of suggest that there's informal and formal. The fact is, they're totally merged. I mean, in the formal city, there's the boot cleaners and there's the hawkers sitting in front of the high-rise towers. So they're everywhere, just to varying degrees. The way I see slums to me are really, they're, whether by, most times not through their own fault, they're just the worst areas of the city in terms of housing and living conditions, and they're clearly the areas that should be upgraded first. So that's what I call a slum. I don't associate any sort of land tenure issue with it. It's clearly they're overcrowded. There's lots of health issues. There's drainage. There's service issues, and clearly, that they're suffering the most. And perhaps they're the ones that really should be put in the front of upgrading programs. So that to me is a slum. They're the sort of worst of the worst. And informal settlements is just the broader sort of label. And a slum, perhaps, is just, to me, it's just a subcategory within an informal settlement. That's how I say. And sure, there are cultural issues, and as we know, there are positives and negatives associated with cultural issues, and some of them will actually, cause a lot of people, especially those when you come to the city, to unfortunately have nowhere else to go but to live, make their lives in slums.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Paul. So it's something. It's different. Yeah. It's just part of informal, and informal. It's different from illegal. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think you can. There's certain things happening in the, I suppose, often I think of the big park opposite us, as you know, at Sydney University, there's a big there called Victoria Park. And look, that's delineated with, formal pathways and bits and pieces. Well, we see people going across the grass when the sprinkler's on. We see people on their bikes, going. We see people sunbaking with their tops off, which wouldn't be accepted in other cultures, but that could be seen as informal. But people aren't going to go and arrest you, for that sort of thing. They let you get away with it. Just like perhaps riding a push bike in some suburbs. It's not, you're not supposed to ride it on the footpath. You're supposed to ride it on the road. But people ride it on the footpath. So it might be illegal in one sense, but it's accepted. I think that's, it's what's accepted and what's not accepted.
Yes. Okay, Paul. Next question is it's almost the same between it's from Clario, and then Pakuan, and from Rizvan. Yeah, it's from Rizvan. And now we explore about the approach to manage the irregularity or something that informal, yeah, in the view of formal planning process. Should we displace, yeah, or remove the population there, yeah, with the new building, with the something formal, like infrastructure, yeah, and also housing with the formal standard, and yes, how we manage, yeah, how we deal with this problem.
Yeah, no, that's a great great question. And look, I think I best to answer it in two ways. I think firstly, given the scale of the informality and the scale of informal settlements, it's clearly not possible to look at a formal solution across all of these, you know, sorts of communities. It's just not possible. It's just not financially possible. It's just not a resource possible to do it. So I think, to me, when I look at these things, I look at it from two perspectives. I look at it from the perspectives that, you know, what would be nice is just to see these people with, you know, just reasonable levels of water and sanitation, and they don't reach the stage where they've, you know, sort of crossed the line, and you know, their environmental decline is sort of gone past the point of no return. And so I think that's the first point, is that if you can give a lot of these areas just some basic amenities and services, and let them know that, you know, there is some sort of caring for them, then I think that's one approach. And I think in parts of Bandung, we definitely see that side of the, you know, the government sort of helping with their administrative units and so forth. So I think that's the sort of big, because the scale is just too big. You know, the scale is just too big. But what we don't want to see is them pushed to the side. The second thing then is really the more interesting challenges then of more formal upgrading, and then how that should proceed. And I suppose a lot of these schemes are caught between governments and developers wanting to maximise their returns, and therefore they'll either impose physical solutions that are perhaps out of scale and not appropriate to an area. But I think, look, the most important thing that you should try with first, and obviously, look, these has to be all work with, you know, communities, is that if you can try, you should try and work in situ as best as possible. Maybe there's some trade-offs, but I suppose the bottom line is that what you're trying to do is recognise that there's certain governance arrangements, there's certain things that the certain glue that gives this urbanism its richness. And I suppose what you want to do is make sure that when you're dealing with communities, that you can replicate some of those things that they like and they desire for in the physical solutions. And I think that to me is the part two of your answer. There's no way that you can formalize the informal with sort of regular top-down standards, and you know, in the main, they often don't work. So you're trying to find a balance, and the balance surely has to start with in situ. And regardless of in situ, you're trying to replicate and ask people the sorts of informal spaces and arrangements that helps keep their social networks and their cultural ties ongoing in any new arrangements. I think that's the challenge.
Yes, thank you, Paul. So this is also a question from Rizvan and Raidi. Yeah? It's how to deal with this situation. Yeah, whether we have to use the formal approach or other approach. Yeah, to deal with the informality.
Yeah.
Now we come to next question, Paul. It's from Benedictus Dwi Agus and from Fajar. Yeah, it's this is about adaptation. It's actually you have already mentioned about negotiation. It's did you find that there is a conflict when the community have an adaptation on their building or private space in Lebak, especially in Lebak Siliwangi? Are there any there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we look from the residents that we talk to, and we talk to some of the longer term ones, is that there are conflicts. Often these things, in our understanding, they're dealt with two levels. They're dealt with on a neighbour to neighbour basis, and then and also landowner to landowner basis. And you must realise that obviously tenants change as well. So these things about balconies and set aboves and set over, they're often sort of negotiated between each other. And as we know, there are certain protocols that you can't go further than 50% across when you're doing a set over, and likewise on the other side. But look, disputes do arise. They do go to the RW and they do go to the RT leaders if they need to. But look, often a lot of these things are resolved, or often, some of the residents will say that they know that if the people are going to move soon, that they'll just wait a little while till someone else comes, and then they'll take advantage of the fact that, again, the boundary might be fluid. But there is a local resolution setting there to get things dealt with. But look, most times these things seem to be worked out. So yeah, so there's definitely, again, protocols. And if you have a look at that paper that myself and Nini did, there's clearly sets of rules there that people use. There's clearly more formal rules and different ways through. Then there's perhaps the informal way.
Yes, Paul, we come to the last question from Susanti. You mentioned about time and space dimension, for adaptation, and how we consider the time. I maybe it's the question is how long is the time, when we consider this is adaptation, when we would like to know about the adaptation, how long is the time for the observation? It's I think that is the question. And what kind of external aspect or factor that influence the adaptation process?
Yep. Okay. Well, I think that the first question's a good one. In fact, you can actually develop yourself just a typology of the sorts of time increments that you might want to analyze some spaces. So, I mean, clearly when students are there doing the fieldwork that we've used in the past, students will just look at it on a 24-hour basis. They'll come, in the morning or at lunchtime and evening. And if they're still there on the weekend, they'll come back. So they can sort of see things in a normal day setting, and they can see things in a weekend setting. But I think, it's a good point. You can take that, that thing out to a monthly or 6 monthly or a year. So hence you could get, various Islamic, activities or Ramadan or different festivities could, again, depending on your temporal sort of length, to sort of break up what happens with these different forms. So I think that's a good point to make, because depending on your time period, it's going to give you a different result about what's happening. The second question, Sri, just remind me again, Sri, the second question.
The external factors that influence the adaptation process. Okay.
Well, some of the figures that we didn't show here is that when we did ask some of the residents what actually pushes your adaptation on, clearly there was things relating to finance and money. There's things related to building materials, whether they'd be recycled or secondhand. And the third thing that influenced them was the fact of getting access to social and community capital. So being able to get other labour in the Kampung, perhaps people from the RW unit to help you. So those things perhaps affect the, those things affect your, the way that you move on your adaptation process. There's obviously going to be wider things that are affected. If you had a longer time in Lebak, you'll see that just adjoining Lebak, there is a lot of houses which have actually got a red marking on it, and they're actually being put there by, I think, by private developers, and they're the marking indicating that some of these houses are squatter housing. So again, there's different forces again trying to either paint for better or worse, and whether it's legal or illegal, trying to paint an image that there's a lot of squatters here. So there's again different forces, trying to. Everyone's got some development agenda, some's got a certain interest, and I suppose you have to live your life according to balancing off those interests. But generally, you find that these areas have got a reasonably strong, pretty good fabric and governance, from what we can understand.
Yes, thank you, Paul. This is very interesting presentation for the student or participant that if you have any question, you can ask Paul, because Paul on Saturday will also come to the studio class. Yeah, so don't worry. And today we have discussed about the informal city. Paul has explained the definition and many definitions related to informal city, and we also discussed about the adaptation process in the informal settlement. And also from the question, we know how to deal with the informal city, or informal settlement. Paul, before I handed over this session to Nurul, I would like to hear greeting some lecturer from ITB. There are Pak Haryo Winarso here, Bu Lisna and Bu Santi, and the lecturer from Diponegoro University, Pak Mukti Ali. Thank you very much have joined this evening session, and also from ITSB, Pak Dadi, Bu Ida, Pak Anjar. Yeah, thank you very much have come to this lecture.
Thank you. Yeah. Hi, Haryo.
Good evening there.
Yeah.
Night, it's night there.
It's it's about 10 o'clock here.
Okay.
So the lights are going out in the house. People are going to sleep. But look, no, thanks for having me, and great to see such a good turnout. And it's great to have, you're very lucky to have the students have a wealth of, expertise with Haryo and Sri and Ninik and Dilik and everyone else there from the department. The students are very lucky this week, so that's great, really good.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Nurul. You can continue this session.
Okay, so thank you for your presentation, Paul. It's very interesting when we talk about the informality and also about the kampung development, especially in Bandung. Also, thank you for Bu Sri Mariati for your time today, despite your busy schedule. So thank you very much. So now mark the end of the second day of International Joint Studios. So we will continue this webinar series tomorrow, and we will talk about the urban landscape during the pandemic by Dr. Budi Faisal from ITB. So I hope you can enjoy and join us for tomorrow lecture. So thank you everyone who joined today's webinar. See you tomorrow at the same time. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Nurul.
Thank you, Paul.